A homeless boy saves a millionaire's wife from a thief. Days later, he learns he has found a new family. Los Angeles pulsed with its usual chaos, a symphony of car horns, hurried footsteps, and distant chatter. Amid this cacophony of urban life, David sat quietly on the cold sidewalk, his presence almost invisible against the bustling city. At 17, his world had already been shaped by loss and struggle. His thin frame was enveloped in a tattered hoodie, its frayed edges a testament to the countless nights it had braved the chill alongside him. A pair of faded jeans, patched and worn, hung loosely on his wiry frame. Resting against his knees was a weathered cardboard sign, its shaky lettering declaring, "Give $5 for food." David's brown eyes flitted over the sea of passing strangers. Most moved with purpose, their faces lit by the glow of their smartphones or the allure of nearby shops. He didn't blame them for ignoring him. He'd grown accustomed to being overlooked, as if he were a shadow blending into the cracks of the city. Yet, deep within, a flicker of hope stubbornly clung to life, whispering that today might be different. Jessica Stone emerged from a high-end boutique just across the street, a picture of effortless elegance. Her blonde hair, immaculately styled, gleamed under the afternoon sun. She held shopping bags in each hand, the logos of luxury brands boldly displayed. Flanked by her friends, their lively laughter carried through the crisp air like the chiming of bells. Jessica's gaze drifted to David as her group strolled down the street. His hunched posture and the quiet plea on his sign tugged at her, igniting an impulse she couldn't ignore. "Hang on," she said, her voice cutting through her friend's chatter. "What's up?" one of them asked, their tone tinged with impatience. Jessica didn't answer immediately. She reached into her pocket, her heels clicking softly against the pavement as she approached the boy. David looked up, startled to see someone stopping for him. A blush of surprise crossed his face, and he instinctively pulled his sign closer, as if shielding himself from judgment. "Hi," Jessica said kindly, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. "I'm not sure if this will help much, but—" She dropped a few coins into his cup, the soft clinking sound breaking the silence between them. David swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, ma'am." Jessica's friends lingered a short distance away, exchanging glances. One called out, her tone light but impatient. "Jessica, come on." "We're going to be late for the cafe." Jessica straightened, brushing the dust from her blazer. "Wait here," she told David with a gentle smile. "I'll be back in a minute." David's eyes followed her as she walked briskly toward a gleaming black Range Rover parked a few blocks down. She opened the passenger door and placed her shopping bags inside, laughing at something her friends said as they caught up to her. The door shut with a soft thud, but David noticed something, a crack, barely perceptible, where the door hadn't latched properly. His brows knitted together. She hadn't locked it. Minutes passed, the city's relentless rhythm beating on. Yet David's focus stayed fixed on the Range Rover. The slight gap in the door nagged at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. A shadow moved across his peripheral vision, breaking his thoughts. A man in a weathered jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face ambled toward the vehicle. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, as if he were waiting for the right moment. David's stomach twisted. He told himself it wasn't his business, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The man glanced over his shoulder, his darting eyes scanning the street. Satisfied that no one was paying attention, he sidled up to the car. David tensed, his body instinctively leaning forward as if ready to act. With a furtive glance, the man slipped his fingers around the edge of the ajar door and pulled it open. He leaned inside, disappearing from David's view. David's chest tightened. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to shout, to draw attention, but fear rooted him to the spot. What if the man turned on him? What if no one believed a homeless boy's word against someone else's? Seconds felt like hours as the man rummaged through the glove compartment. Then, emerging with a triumphant smirk, he held up a small velvet pouch. David's breath hitched. Whatever was in that pouch, it wasn't his to take. "Hey!" The word burst from David's mouth, louder than he'd expected. The man froze, his head snapping toward David, their eyes locked, one pair wide with determination, the other narrowing with annoyance. "What's it to you, kid?" The man growled, his voice low and menacing. David scrambled to his feet, his legs trembling but his resolve hardening. "That's not your car," he called out, louder this time. "Put it back." The man's lip curled in disdain. "Mind your own business, street rat," he spat, stepping away from the car with the pouch still in hand. David clenched his fists, his heart hammering in his chest. His shout had drawn the attention of a few passers-by, who slowed their steps, their curious gazes flitting between the boy and the thief. "What's going on here?" an older woman demanded, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. David pointed, his hand shaking. "He's stealing from that car." The man's eyes darted to the small crowd forming. Realizing his time was up, he cursed under his breath. With a reluctant snarl, he tossed the pouch back into the glove compartment and slammed the door shut. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his tone dripping with malice. Turning on his heel, he vanished into a nearby alley, the sound of his hurried footsteps fading into the distance. David stood frozen, his chest heaving with adrenaline. The onlookers, their curiosity satisfied, began to disperse, their whispers melting into the city's background noise. Glancing at the Range Rover, now securely shut, David exhaled a shaky breath. Relief mixed with unease coursed through him. Who was that man? And what had he been after? Though he longed to return to his quiet spot on the sidewalk, something kept him rooted in place. Jessica had been kind enough to notice him, a rare act of humanity in his world. The least he could do was guard the car until she returned. David stood by the Range Rover, his body tense and his mind racing. The thief's parting words still echoed in his head, a sinister warning that sent chills down his spine. As the city moved on around him, the sleek black car seemed to shine brighter in the dimming light, a beacon of a world far removed from his own. He glanced around nervously, his eyes scanning for any sign of the thief's return. The man's hurried escape and the velvet pouch he had tried to steal haunted David's thoughts. What's in that pouch? He wondered. He couldn't bring himself to check, knowing it wasn't his place. Yet the thief's desperation hinted at something far more valuable than just money. The crowd thinned as evening approached, and David's unease grew. A few passers-by spared him suspicious glances, their eyes darting between him and the luxury vehicle. A tall man in a suit paused briefly, his phone pressed to his ear. Lowering it, he asked, "Is this your car?" David shook his head. "No, sir. I'm just watching it for someone." The man frowned but moved on, resuming his conversation. David sighed, leaning back against the wall behind him. His hands trembled slightly, not from the chill in the air, but from the weight of responsibility he felt. He couldn't leave. Not yet. A sudden sound of heels clicking against the pavement caught his attention. David's heart lifted as he saw Jessica returning with her friends. She was carrying her coffee cup, the steam rising in the cool evening air. Her friends walked beside her, still engrossed in their conversation. Jessica slowed as she neared the car, her eyes landing on David. Her expression shifted from surprise to mild confusion. "Boy," she called out, her tone uncertain. "What are you doing here?" David stepped forward, his voice quick and anxious. "There was a man. He tried to steal something from your car." Jessica's brows knitted together as she stopped a few feet away. "What? What do you mean? Someone was here?" "Yes," David said, gesturing toward the car. He opened the door and went through the glove compartment. He pulled out a small pouch, but I yelled and he ran off. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, the lightheartedness of their outing now replaced by concern. Jessica opened the car door, her movements sharp and hurried. She rummaged through the glove compartment, her hands trembling slightly. When her fingers closed around the velvet pouch, she exhaled in relief. This belonged to my mother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's all I have left of her." David stood silently, unsure of what to say. Jessica turned to him, her eyes brimming with emotion. You stopped him," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved this." David shrugged, his face flushing. "I just didn't want him to get away with it." Jessica's friends murmured their astonishment, one of them placing a hand on her arm. "You're so lucky," the friend said. "What if he'd taken it?" Jessica nodded absently, her gaze fixed on David. "I don't even know how to thank you," she said. Before David could respond, one of her friends leaned in and whispered something, gesturing toward the nearby cafe. Jessica nodded, seeming to make a decision. "David," she said, her voice firm but kind, "I have to go for now, but I'll be back soon. Please wait here. My husband and I will come find you in a couple of hours." David blinked, her words catching him off guard. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she replied. "I want to talk to you. Please, just don't leave, okay?" David hesitated but nodded. Jessica and her friends walked off toward the cafe, leaving David alone again. He stood for a moment, processing what had just happened. Her gratitude had been genuine, and the way she'd looked at him, like he mattered, was something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the street grew quieter. David shifted on his feet, his nerves still on edge from the earlier encounter. He couldn't shake the image of the thief's sneer, the man's parting words playing on a loop in his mind. From the shadows of an alleyway nearby, movement caught his eye. His breath hitched as a figure emerged, lingering just beyond the reach of the streetlights. David's heart pounded as he recognized the thief's silhouette. The man stood still for a moment, as if debating whether to approach. David clenched his fists, his body rigid. But then the figure retreated, fading back into the darkness. David exhaled shakily, relief and unease mingling in his chest. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the city. David stayed close to the car, his vigilance unwavering. He didn't know what Jessica had planned, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. The city lights twinkled against the inky sky as David stood guard by the Range Rover. The earlier adrenaline rush had waned, replaced by an exhaustion he refused to give into. Though his stomach growled and his thin hoodie did little to keep the chill at bay, he stayed rooted to his spot. His gaze occasionally flicked to the street, scanning for any sign of Jessica's return. The minutes felt like hours, and the earlier appearance of the thief in the shadows still left him uneasy. Yet, despite the fear and discomfort, David couldn't shake the small ember of hope kindled by Jessica's promise to return. The low hum of an approaching car drew his attention. His heart quickened as a sleek black sedan pulled up, its headlights washing over him. The car parked beside the Range Rover, and David recognized Jessica stepping out, now accompanied by a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit. Jessica smiled warmly as she approached him. "David, thank you for waiting," she said, her tone genuine. The man beside her studied David, his sharp features softening as he extended a hand. "You must be the young man my wife told me about. I'm Ethan Stone. Thank you for protecting something so important to us." David hesitated for a moment before shaking Ethan's hand. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said quietly. Ethan chuckled lightly. "Trust me, not everyone would. What you did took courage." Jessica stepped closer, her gaze filled with concern. "How long have you been out here?" she asked softly. David shrugged, his eyes dropping to the ground. "A while." Jessica and Ethan exchanged a glance, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Well," Jessica said, her voice firm but kind, "we're not leaving you here tonight. You've done enough for us, and now it's our turn to do something for you." David blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" Ethan gestured toward the car. "We'll explain on the way. First, let's get you somewhere warm." David hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. But the kindness in their faces was hard to refuse. Nodding slightly, he followed them to the sedan. The plush leather seats felt foreign against his worn jeans, and he sat stiffly, unsure of what to do with his hands. Jessica noticed his unease and gave him an encouraging smile. "Relax, David," she said gently. "You're safe with us." Their first stop was a nearby barber shop. The neon sign buzzed faintly as they entered, and the warm air was a stark contrast to the chill outside. The barber, an older man with kind eyes, greeted them with a nod. "What can I do for you folks tonight?" Ethan gestured toward David. "He needs the works. A fresh cut? A clean shave? Whatever you think will suit him best." David's cheeks flushed as the barber guided him to a chair. He glanced at Jessica and Ethan, who gave him reassuring nods. As the clippers buzzed to life, David felt the weight of months of grime and neglect being lifted. He watched in the mirror as his matted hair was trimmed away, revealing sharp cheekbones and tired but bright eyes. When the barber finished, David barely recognized himself. "You look great," Jessica said with a smile as he stepped down from the chair. David glanced at his reflection once more, a small, tentative smile tugging at his lips. Their next stop was a small diner. The aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling burgers filled the air as they slid into a booth. "Order whatever you want," Ethan said, handing David a menu. David hesitated, his eyes scanning the options before settling on a burger and fries. When the food arrived, he ate slowly at first, savoring each bite. Jessica and Ethan watched him with quiet smiles, not wanting to overwhelm him with questions just yet. After the meal, they drove to their home, an elegant estate nestled in the hills. The driveway was lined with manicured hedges, and the warm glow from the windows gave the house a welcoming feel. David's jaw dropped slightly as he stepped out of the car. "This is your house?" he asked in awe. Jessica laughed softly. "Yes, it is. Come inside. You can stay with us tonight." Inside, the house was just as impressive as the exterior, with polished floors, high ceilings, and tasteful decor. A large fireplace crackled in the living room, casting a golden glow across the space. Jessica led David to a comfortable chair by the fire, while Ethan brought him a cup of hot chocolate. "Now," Jessica said, sitting across from him, "tell us about yourself, David. How did you end up here?" David stared into the cup in his hands, the steam curling into the air. His voice was quiet as he began to speak. "My parents died in a plane crash when I was 10, he said, his tone heavy with emotion. "It was just the three of us. After they were gone, I didn't have anyone else. My relatives couldn't or wouldn't take me in, so I ended up in foster care. Jessica's eyes softened with empathy. I'm so sorry, David. David nodded slightly, his gaze distant. I stayed with a few different families, but it never worked out. When I was 15, the house I was staying in caught fire. I got out, but I lost everything. Jessica gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. I couldn't go back into the system, David continued. So I left. I've been on the streets ever since. Ethan leaned forward, his expression serious. That's a lot for anyone to go through, especially someone your age. But you don't have to keep living like this. Let us help you. David looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. Help me? How? For starters, Jessica said with a smile, we'll find you a place to stay. A small apartment, maybe, where you can have some stability. And we'll cover your groceries for a while, Ethan added, until you get back on your feet. David's throat tightened, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do that for me? Jessica reached over, placing a hand on his arm. Because you helped us, David. You went out of your way to do something good, and that deserves to be repaid. For the first time in years, David felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. The next morning, sunlight poured through the large windows of the Stones' elegant living room, casting warm rays on the soft cream-colored furniture. David stirred on the couch, blinking against the light. For a moment, he forgot where he was, the memory of his life on the streets tugging at the edges of his mind. Then, the events of the previous evening came rushing back. The kindness of Jessica and Ethan, the warm meal, and the promise of help. It all felt like a dream. The faint clatter of dishes pulled his attention. Jessica entered the room, holding a tray with scrambled eggs, toast, and a glass of orange juice. Good morning, she said brightly. I thought you might be hungry. David sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Good morning. Thank you, ma'am. You didn't have to. She waved off his protest with a smile. Of course I did. And please, just call me Jessica. After breakfast, Ethan joined them, a stack of papers in hand. David, we're going to take you to see a few places today, he said, sitting across from him. I've contacted a realtor who found some small apartments nearby. Nothing fancy, but safe and comfortable. David hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Are you sure about this? I don't want to be a burden. Ethan leaned forward, his tone firm but kind. You're not a burden, David. You're young, smart, and resourceful. All you need is a little support to get back on your feet. Jessica chimed in, her voice soft. You helped us when you didn't have to, David. Let us do the same for you. David nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. Okay, thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Jessica smiled. You'll repay us by building a good life for yourself. The day was a whirlwind of activity. The Stones took David to tour a few apartments, each one modest but far better than anything he'd imagined for himself. By the afternoon, they settled on a small studio in a quiet neighborhood. The apartment was simple, with a cozy kitchenette, a clean bathroom, and a window that overlooked a small park. This is perfect, David said, his voice filled with awe as he stood in the empty space. Ethan nodded. We'll take care of the first few months' rent. That'll give you time to settle in and focus on what's next. Jessica placed a hand on David's shoulder. We also stocked up on groceries for you. The basics, just to get you started. David's throat tightened as he tried to find the words. I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever thought I'd have. That evening, they returned to the Stones' home, where Ethan handed David a piece of paper. "We've also lined up a job for you," he said with a grin. David unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the text. "An office assistant. At your company?" Ethan nodded. "It's a starting position, but it's steady work. And who knows? With some hard work, you might move up the ladder someday." David smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you. I'll do my best. I promise." Later that night, as David settled into the couch for what he assumed would be his last night at the Stones' house, Jessica sat beside him. "Can I ask you something?" she said gently. David nodded. "Of course. What was it like? On the streets? How did you survive?" David hesitated, his fingers fiddling with the hem of his hoodie. "It was hard," he admitted. "You get used to being invisible. People look right through you like you're not even there. Some days you don't eat. Some days you get chased off by security guards. But you keep going because what else can you do?" Jessica's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that, David." David shook his head. "It's okay. I mean, it's not okay, but it taught me a lot. About people, about myself. And now, I guess I have a chance to start over." Jessica reached over and squeezed his hand. "You do, David, and we'll be here to help you every step of the way." As they sat in silence, a phone rang from the other room. Jessica excused herself to answer it, her voice fading as she moved down the hall. Minutes later, she returned, her expression troubled. "David," she began, sitting down beside him again, "that was someone claiming to be your mother." David's body went rigid. "My mother?" Jessica nodded, her tone cautious. "She said she's been trying to find you and demanded to know where you are. She didn't sound well." David's jaw clenched, his voice low. "That's not my mother. She's gone. She and my dad died in a plane crash. Whoever that was, they're lying." Jessica frowned. "She mentioned something about wanting you back. She said she deserves to see you." "She doesn't," David said firmly, his hands balling into fists. "I don't know who she is, but she's not my family." Jessica exchanged a glance with Ethan, who had just entered the room. "We'll handle it," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Whoever it is, they have no claim to you, David. You're safe here." David nodded, though his heart raced with a mix of fear and anger. "Thank you for everything." "You don't have to thank us," Jessica said softly. "You're part of our family now." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change for David. The Stones had kept their promise, helping him transition from a life on the streets to one filled with stability and purpose. His small apartment, once an empty space, was now cozy and lived in, with a few personal touches. Books from Jessica, a sturdy desk from Ethan, and even a framed photo of the three of them taken during a recent outing. David had embraced his new job as an office assistant at Ethan's company, eager to prove himself. Though he was just starting, his dedication and willingness to learn quickly earned him respect among his co-workers. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, but the peace he'd found was soon threatened by a voice from his past. One evening, David was preparing for his first big work presentation when Jessica received another call from the woman claiming to be David's mother. This time, the voice on the other end was colder, angrier. "You had no right to take my son," the woman spat. "David belongs with me, his real family." Jessica's hand tightened around the phone. "If you're his mother, where were you all these years? Why didn't you look for him when he needed you most?" The woman hesitated, her voice faltering before regaining its edge. "I've made mistakes, but I'm still his mother. You can't just keep him away from me." Jessica's stomach churned with unease. She knew David's story, his parents' tragic death, and the hardships he'd endured. This woman wasn't his mother. Still, the venom in her voice made it clear she wouldn't back down easily. That night, Jessica and Ethan sat down with David to share the news. She called again. Jessica began, her tone cautious. David looked up from his notebook, his brow furrowing. "What did she say?" "She claims to be your mother," Ethan said, his voice steady. "She's demanding that we let you go back to her." David's jaw clenched, and his hands balled into fists. "She's lying. My parents are dead. Whoever this is, she's just trying to use me." Jessica reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "We believe you, David, but she's persistent. She might try to take legal action to get custody." David's eyes widened in alarm. "Custody? She can't do that. Can she?" Ethan sighed. "Legally, it's complicated. She could claim she's your biological parent, but without proof, she doesn't have much of a case. Still, we'll need to be prepared." Jessica nodded. "We've already contacted a lawyer. If it comes to it, we'll fight for you. You're part of our family now, David. We won't let anyone take you away." The next few weeks were tense. The woman, whose name they learned was Monica, had filed a petition claiming to be David's mother and demanding his immediate return. Jessica and Ethan's lawyer advised them to gather as much evidence as possible to refute her claim. David was forced to revisit painful memories, recounting the details of his parents' plane crash and the years he spent in foster care. Though it was difficult, he knew it was necessary to prove Monica's story false. In the meantime, Monica began showing up unannounced, waiting outside David's apartment or following him to work. Her presence was unnerving, her disheveled appearance and erratic behavior a stark contrast to the composed image she tried to present in court filings. One evening, as David returned home from work, he found Monica waiting near his building. She stepped out of the shadows, her eyes wild and her voice desperate. "David," she called out, her tone pleading. "Please, just talk to me. I'm your mother. Don't you remember me?" David froze, his body tense. "You're not my mother," he said firmly. "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave me alone." Tears streamed down Monica's face as she reached for him. "I made mistakes, but I'm here now. Let me make it right. Let me be your family again." David stepped back, shaking his head. "My family is Jessica and Ethan. They're the ones who cared for me when no one else did. Now, leave me alone." Monica's expression darkened, and she muttered something under her breath before storming off. The court date arrived, and tensions were high. Jessica and Ethan sat beside David, their lawyer outlining their case with precision and confidence. Monica, on the other hand, struggled to present a coherent argument, her claims often contradicting themselves. When it was David's turn to speak, he stood tall, his voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "My parents died when I was 10, he began, addressing the judge. "I've been on my own ever since. If Monica really was my mother, she would have found me years ago. But she didn't. Jessica and Ethan, they're the ones who gave me a second chance. They're my real family." His words hung in the air, resonating with everyone in the courtroom. The judge ruled in favor of Jessica and Ethan, dismissing Monica's petition and granting the Stones legal guardianship over David. Relief washed over them as they left the courtroom, their bond stronger than ever. Monica was escorted out, her protests falling on deaf ears. David watched her go, a mix of pity and anger in his heart. She had tried to take away the one thing he'd fought so hard to build, a sense of belonging. But she had failed. Life slowly returned to normal. David flourished under the Stones' guidance, excelling in his job, and even enrolling in night classes to continue his education. He often reflected on how far he'd come from the cold streets of Los Angeles to a life filled with opportunity and love. One evening, as the family sat around the dining table, Jessica raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "To family," David added, his voice filled with gratitude. They clinked their glasses, the sound a symbol of the life they had built together, a life that no one could take away. Thank you for listening to this story. Please write in the comments what you would do if you were David and someone tried to steal the one thing giving you hope. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, share your stories in the comments, and who knows, maybe your story will be next on the channel. See you next time.